On the morning of April 28, 1945, 2 days before the fall of Adolf Hitler, American forces approached Dachau. Several units had participated in the advance, and due to the size of the facility, it was difficult to determine which had entered first. The highest-ranking officer present was Brigadier General Henning Linden, who accepted the surrender of the SS officers remaining within the compound. For many soldiers, Dachau was one of their first direct contacts with the machinery of extermination, a glimpse of the open graves and gassing systems that would soon be discovered elsewhere in Europe. In the months before the Allies' arrival, camps like Dachau had been intensely active, not only in the elimination of prisoners but also in the concealment of all traces of what had happened. German officers were aware that they would be held accountable for war crimes, and some deserted before the arrival of enemy troops. Those who remained attempted to destroy documents and eliminate the last inmates who could serve as witnesses. However, Germany's critical state prevented them from carrying out this task on a large scale. Ammunition was scarce, resources were scarce, and there was no capacity to carry out mass executions as in previous years. In April 1945, Dachau was operated by a very small group of SS officers. Most had fled to the Alps with the intention of holding out there, while those who remained tried to maintain order in an already crumbling environment. American military Dr. Harold Porter was assigned to assist in the liberation of the camp. In a letter to his family, he described how, upon arriving at the outskirts of the city, they found a train with 50 damaged cars. Each one was packed with corpses, thousands of bodies showing clear signs of starvation. This formation, later dubbed the Death Train, became one of the first tangible evidences of the Holocaust. Inside the compound, the scenes were even more disturbing. Porter recounted being led to the crematorium, where he found a 6-meter-high room completely filled with bodies piled to the ceiling. The stench was unbearable. Faces were blackened, eyes bulged, and the figures were nothing more than bones covered in skin. These images remained etched in the memories of the soldiers who participated in the liberation, many of whom were unable to process what they saw. While Nazi brutality was known, the magnitude of the horror surpassed any previous understanding. Some soldiers broke down emotionally, while others chose to suppress their feelings in order to fulfill their duties. However, not all reacted the same way. In several units, the sight of the corpses generated uncontrollable rage. Troops of the 45th Infantry Division went mad upon witnessing the death train. When 4 SS officers surrendered, Lieutenant William Walsh led them to the carriages and executed them on the spot. This act of retaliation was not an isolated incident. Walsh and his men continued advancing through the countryside and, faced with piles of corpses, decided to apply what they understood as immediate justice. 30 officers of the SS were taken to an internal sector, and 17 of them were shot dead before a superior officer managed to stop the execution. It is estimated that in total between 50 and 120 Germans were killed by American soldiers driven by rage. The exact number could never be confirmed. In some cases, soldiers gave weapons to the liberated prisoners so they could execute their former guards themselves. Doctors also refused to treat wounded SS officers, resulting in the deaths of several. Eventually, when General Patton assumed military governorship of Bavaria, he ordered a freeze on any investigation into these crimes committed during the liberation. Those responsible for the shootings and spontaneous acts of revenge were never punished. At Auschwitz, the liberation was carried out differently, as it was carried out by Soviet forces. Around 7,000 prisoners remained there when the Red Army arrived in late January 1945. Many wept with relief at the sight of the soldiers, although the Soviets didn't fully understand what they were finding. Once they searched the grounds, they came across open graves, rooms filled with bones, and bags containing the cut hairs of thousands of people. Colonel Basil Petrenko, commander of the 107th Infantry Division, later wrote that, despite having witnessed constant death on the front lines, he was shocked by the absolute hatred the Nazis had shown their victims. In camps like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, the Soviets chose to keep them operating after liberation, albeit with a different purpose. They were used to imprison German officers, citizens accused of collaborating with the regime, or people suspected of opposing the new administration. According to contemporary reports, living conditions in these Soviet-controlled centers were very harsh. almost comparable to those suffered by prisoners under the Nazis. The Dachau campaign of April 29, 1945, went down as one of the bloodiest. That day, during the final stages of the evacuation, American units intercepted a transport carrying 4,000 prisoners that managed to continue toward Germany. They accelerated their march and, upon arriving at the camp, found more than 30,000 inmates still in deplorable conditions. The entry of the American battalions led to further executions of surrendered officers. Captain Wilsey, an anesthesiologist with the 7th Army, had participated in the Normandy landings and treated thousands of wounded soldiers. He thought he'd seen it all, but as he passed through the gates of Dachau, he was confronted with a scene beyond any previous experience. He described piles of shoes and uniforms stacked in warehouses, still smoking ovens, and, above all, the skeletal bodies of living prisoners who looked like the living dead. Toothless, weak, dehydrated, and weakened by lack of food, these men and women could barely stand. Wilsey then understood what had driven his comrades to act so violently. In his later letters, he recounted how many soldiers were scarred for life by that experience. Some justified what happened as an inevitable consequence of what they had witnessed. The violence unleashed at Dachau continued in the hours following the troops' entry. Tower B, which served as a second sentry post, became the scene of systematic shootings. Several German guards who had laid down their weapons were forced to kneel and then shot in the head. Lieutenant Walsh himself captured 4 SS officers, forced them into a car containing around 120 corpses, and after holding them inside for a while, murdered them on the spot. That same day, a young 19-year-old artilleryman opened fire on 12 prisoners of war in a coal depot. He was found by Colonel Sparks in a state of shock, crying and shouting that he had to fire because the Germans wanted to escape. The accounts of that event made it clear that for many soldiers, the line between justice and revenge had become completely blurred amid the tension. On the morning of the second day, around 50 SS officers were forced to strip naked and stand outdoors, performing the Nazi salute with their arms raised. The Americans threw buckets of ice-cold water over them while they held this position. This was a practice the guards themselves had imposed on the prisoners for years. This time, the conditions included the threat of immediate execution if anyone lowered their arm. All were shot before noon. In contemporary letters, Captain Wilsey coldly described watching his comrades capture an SS member, torture him, and then shoot him without showing any emotion. He said that after witnessing the atrocities committed by these men, it was difficult not to understand the reaction of his comrades. Some soldiers even decided to issue rifles to Jewish prisoners who still had strength, allowing them to guard and punish the German guards as they saw fit. The prisoners' reaction was immediate. Many directed their fury at the Kapos, privileged prisoners who had wielded power over others in the name of the Nazis. Some were beaten to death in the barracks, while others were summarily executed. The violence of those days extended beyond the SS guards and also reached those prisoners who had collaborated with them. In the first official reports, the number of Germans killed during the liberation was estimated at between 50 and 100. However, later accounts suggest the figure may have exceeded 500. Official US government accounts reported 32,000 prisoners liberated and around 300 enemy soldiers killed. However, the details of how these deaths occurred would only come to light several decades later when some private documents and letters were publicly analyzed. The psychological impact on the soldiers was profound. Many were forever scarred by what they witnessed at Dachau. Wilsey, in particular, recounted in his memoirs how the horrors of the camp mingled in his mind with images of the executions. For years, he attributed what happened to a kind of collective delirium resulting from the stress of war and the brutality suddenly revealed. At Auschwitz, Soviet troops also faced a devastating scenario. The 7,000 surviving prisoners were in a state of extreme weakness. They could barely walk, and many resembled living skeletons. As they searched the facility, soldiers found rooms filled with bones, warehouses full of personal belongings, and bags of hair cut from thousands of murdered women. The crematoriums showed signs of intensive use until their final days. The difference with Dachau was that, after the liberation, there were no massive Soviet reprisals against captured Germans inside the camp. However, as they advanced into German territory, Red Army troops did carry out acts of widespread revenge, looting and executions, reflecting the hatred accumulated over years of occupation and destruction. In camps like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, once liberated, the Soviets decided to use them as detention centers. They confined German officers, civilian collaborators, and suspected opponents of the new regime. Contemporary reports indicated that living conditions in these centers were harsh, comparable to those suffered by victims under Nazi control. Thus, places that had been scenes of horror continued to be spaces of confinement and suffering under a new administration. The liberation of the camps revealed to the world the magnitude of the genocide. Images of the starving prisoners, the piles of corpses, and the crematoria began circulating among journalists and military personnel. Many soldiers who participated in the operations declared years later that those visions had stayed with them for life. The certainty that they had witnessed one of the most atrocious crimes in history marked their lives irreversibly. The Allies' first contact with this reality occurred at Dachau and Auschwitz, but it was soon replicated elsewhere. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British troops, offered similar scenes. Thousands of unburied bodies, dying prisoners, and epidemics spreading uncontrollably. Medical teams had to work against the clock to save those who still had a chance of survival. Most, however, died in the following weeks. In each liberated camp, the same pattern was repeated. The Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence, burn archives, and eliminate witnesses, but the magnitude of the crimes made it impossible to conceal everything. Soldiers encountered trains filled with corpses, barracks overcrowded with the sick, and warehouses filled with human belongings that the Nazis had never managed to transport. This accumulation of evidence became the most compelling material to demonstrate the existence of a systematic extermination plan. The memory of Dachau was linked not only to the discovery of horror, but also to the uncontrolled reaction of the liberating soldiers. Testimonies from those days show that, faced with the sight of thousands of bodies piled up and prisoners reduced to skeletons, many men were unable to maintain military discipline. The violence perpetrated against the German guards became a topic of silence for decades, protected by higher orders and the interest in preserving the image of the victorious armies. The liberation of the camps marked the beginning of a process in which the world began to understand the magnitude of Nazi crimes. The soldiers became direct witnesses, and their accounts became fundamental evidence for the trials that would follow. However, the way those days unfolded also revealed the weight of anger, pain, and the desire for revenge that accompanied the armies in their final advance on Germany. The fields of horror, how the cruelest experiments were hidden at the Buchenwald concentration camp. Facilities were set up for testing for infectious diseases. A separate section, known as the typhus block, housed prisoners who had been deliberately exposed to the disease. The conditions were unsanitary, and wooden stretchers were placed side by side. For these tests, prisoners of different nationalities were divided into two groups. Some were directly infected with the typhus virus, while others were injected with potential vaccines. The progression of the disease in each group was then observed. These practices were carried out in secret, and no official records were kept to identify the victims, as names were not recorded on any visible list, and everything was handled with codes or numbers. In another case, at the Dachau concentration camp, low-temperature tests were conducted. There, doctors sought to determine how long a person could withstand extreme cold, so they immersed prisoners in icy water for several hours. Some were left naked in the open air, while others were placed in chambers where the temperature was gradually reduced. Physical reactions were documented, such as shivering, loss of consciousness, and collapse. Sometimes resuscitation methods were attempted, such as hot showers or contact with other bodies, but in most cases the subjects did not survive. As at Buchenwald, records were manipulated or eliminated, and many corpses were quickly cremated without autopsies or documents explaining the true causes of death. At Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp, experimental surgical interventions were performed. Some women were forced to undergo operations without anesthesia, where a leg was opened to insert contaminated objects or bone fragments. The goal was to cause artificial infections for later testing of drugs. On other occasions, muscles or tendons were cut to study the effects on mobility. The wounds were deliberately treated poorly to observe their progress. The women were left with serious after effects or died as a result. Practices. The camp authorities maintained silence and ordered the other prisoners not to speak about what was happening in the infirmary. If anyone did, they were punished or eliminated. The doctors responsible for these procedures often had the assistance of other prisoners. Some were nurses forced to collaborate, while others were medical students detained for political or racial reasons. These prisoner doctors were constantly watched and knew that if they refused to follow orders, they could be replaced or killed. Many lived in constant fear, knowing they were participating in acts that went against all medical principles. Some tried to alleviate the victims' suffering in secret, providing painkillers or altering procedures to make them less cruel, but any act of compassion was dangerous. At Auschwitz, one of the largest and most well-known camps, various experiments were carried out. One of the most notorious was carried out by a doctor who focused on twins. He selected identical siblings and applied different treatments to them or subjected them to parallel procedures to compare the effects. For example, one child was injected with a substance while the other's blood was repeatedly drawn. If one twin died, the other was also killed, as their bodies were later examined for internal differences. This camp also included testing chemicals on eyes, forced sterilizations and amputations without medical justification. Official reports of these experiments rarely mentioned specific details. The documents were written in general terms, using phrases like clinical trial or reaction observation, without explaining that the subjects were forced prisoners. The regime's authorities knew that these practices were difficult to defend to the world, so they avoided leaving clear evidence. When they learned that a camp might be liberated by the Allies, many papers were quickly destroyed and the doctors involved fled or changed their identities to avoid being identified. Surviving witnesses tried to recount what they saw but were often disbelieved or given no space to speak. Some of these accounts only came to light years later after more in-depth investigations were conducted. The testimonies describe scenes of extreme pain, mutilated bodies, and forced silence. They also mention how some doctors tried to justify their actions by claiming they were acting for the good of science, even though they knew the methods were brutal. The secrecy within the camps stemmed not only from the Nazi commanders but also from the prisoners' fear. Talking about the experiments could cost them their lives, so many preferred to remain silent. Even after the war, the fear persisted. Some former prisoners took decades to tell their stories, and many did so only in closed circles or through researchers who gained their trust. This silence contributed to the fact that the true extent of medical abuse in the camps remained unknown for a long time. In addition to doctors, scientists sent from universities or external laboratories also participated. These experts arrived at the camps with lists of substances to test, and they requested subjects for their studies. They did not usually interact directly with the prisoners, but rather gave instructions and then analyzed the results sent to them. This distance allowed them to feel less responsible, although they knew they were working with data obtained through torture and death. When the war ended, many of these scientists returned to their institutions without facing legal consequences. Despite the level of cover-up, some documents managed to survive. Fragments of reports, handwritten notes, and partial medical records were recovered by the Allies or hidden by individuals wishing to preserve the truth. These materials were key to reconstructing what had happened. Thanks to them and the testimonies of survivors, we learned how medical operations operated within the camps, who was responsible, and what methods they used to conceal their actions. In some cases, doctors who participated in these practices attempted to justify themselves in court after the war. They claimed they were only following orders, that they didn't know exactly what was happening, or that their intention was to contribute to the advancement of medicine. However, many of these arguments were rejected, as evidence showed they acted consciously and voluntarily. Some were convicted, others managed to escape, and a few were even hired by foreign governments interested in their scientific knowledge, regardless of how they obtained it. The use of internal codes to refer to prisoners, the elimination of records, unmarked cremations, and the control over what could be said inside the camp were all part of a deliberate strategy to hide the truth. This system was so effective that for years many of these practices remained obscure. Only with time, and with the perseverance of historians, lawyers, and survivors, did the truth begin to be revealed. At the Ravensbrück camp, surgical procedures were performed under conditions that violated any hygiene or anesthesia standards. The women were forced to lie on an unprotected table. Their arms and legs were tied, and they were restrained by staff who had to keep them still throughout the procedure. Doctors made cuts in their legs, deliberately broke bones, introduced bacteria, or removed muscles without informing the patients what they were going to do. These women were then left bedridden without antibiotics or care, and many died from infections or hemorrhages. The records were incomplete or coded so that no one could understand them if they were discovered. At Buchenwald, experiments with typhoid fever and vaccines were carried out without consent. Some prisoners were chosen because they had been identified as misfits or unfit for the work, which made it easier to eliminate them without raising suspicion. Doctors injected viruses, waited for the body's reaction, and recorded the results on sheets that were then sent to research institutes. Initials or codes were used to identify patients. If one died, they were simply replaced by another from the same group. The information was stored in a way that could not be directly linked to real names, making it impossible to reconstruct what had happened. At Dachau, the effects of extreme cold were tested by immersing prisoners in tanks of icy water. Some became unconscious within minutes. Others screamed or trembled until they lost consciousness. When this happened, doctors recorded the duration of exposure and the time it took for them to die. In some cases, attempts were made to revive them with unproven methods. The data was considered valuable to military aviation and was sent with technical details to high-ranking officials. However, this information was not allowed to circulate outside authorized circles, and many of the documents were eliminated after they had been analyzed. In some camps, children were used as test subjects. At Auschwitz, there were recorded cases where twins were used in comparative experiments. One sibling received a substance while the other received nothing. Doctors then studied the effects, and in several cases, autopsies were performed to examine the organs. The files used numbers instead of names. There were no photographs or detailed physical descriptions. Thus, if the file was destroyed, there was no evidence of what had been done. The children were told they were going to the hospital or a consultation, but in reality they were taken to closed rooms where the procedures were performed. In all these experiments, the doctors avoided using their full names. They signed with initials or didn't sign at all. The reports were sent by messenger rather than official mail, and often no copy was left at the testing site. If any prisoner managed to survive, they weren't allowed to speak to the others or mention what had happened to them. Several were isolated or transferred to other camps. Some simply disappeared without explanation. The rest knew something had happened, but couldn't prove it. There were also cases in which the imprisoned doctors themselves were forced to participate. Some were Jews or communists who had been professionals before their arrest. They were given the choice of collaborating or being executed. If they agreed, they had to assist in experiments, care for patients, or even perform autopsies. They could not refuse or abandon their duties. Some took personal notes, but these notebooks were confiscated in surprise raids. Others were promised better conditions. They did cooperate, but most were eventually eliminated when they were no longer useful. In certain locations, chemical substances and poison gas were tested. At Natzweiler, prisoners were exposed to gases to measure their resistance. The results were recorded on sheets signed by technicians working for companies linked to the military. When the bodies were examined, the lungs were destroyed to hide the visible effects. The reports referred to expected reactions or tolerance without explaining the conditions under which the data were obtained. Only a very small group had full access to the files, and orders were often issued orally, with no written record left. At the Sachsenhausen camp, prisoners were used to test bullets, explosives, or combat wounds. Injuries were deliberately created to later evaluate healing methods. Doctors were told they were collaborating with national defense. They weren't required to take a medical oath, nor was there any discussion of ethics. Everything was framed as the need of the moment. Prisoners were labeled as available items or expendable cargo. The lists weren't kept for more than a few weeks. If anything went wrong, everything was destroyed, and the procedure repeated with other prisoners. When the Allies approached the camps, many documents were burned or buried. The doctors who had participated tried to change their identities or flee. Some destroyed the rooms where the experiments had been conducted. Others killed the surviving prisoners so they could not testify. Chemicals were used to erase bloodstains or burns on the walls. In some cases, fake facilities were built on top of the real ones to conceal what had happened. All of this was done under orders that were not recorded in writing, making it difficult to reconstruct the events later. Once the war was over, many of the surviving reports were incomplete or illegible. Fragments were found containing codes, drawings, or tables that could not be interpreted without the original keys. Some were sent to other countries by scientists who had been captured and then recruited. Others were kept by doctors trying to protect themselves from accusations. The lack of concrete documentation meant that several crimes could not be prosecuted and many perpetrators were never identified. Certain experiments were mentioned in the trials, but many victims were never named because there were no reliable records of their time in the camps. The vast majority of the victims left no written trace. Their names do not appear in the archives, their stories were not told, and their bodies were disposed of without a grave or a mark. What happened at these sites was deliberately concealed from the moment it happened, with methods designed to erase all traces of what was being done. This cover-up was as systematic as the crimes themselves. The Third Reich's medical farce: vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and murder disguised as science. The Nazi authorities began to use medicine not only as a tool of public health, but also as an ideological and absolute weapon of control. Within this framework, pharmaceutical companies, research institutes, and hospitals acted directly or indirectly to sustain a system that blended supposed science with brutal practices. It was not only about controlling diseases, but also about using medical discourse to justify deadly actions. Companies that manufactured vaccines, medications, and hygiene products were integrated into an official network that placed them at the service of the regime. Medical reports of the time used terms such as therapeutic sterilization, treatment of asocial individuals, and elimination therapy. Beneath these technical phrases, what was actually happening was the murder of thousands of people considered useless or dangerous to the regime's vision of national health. One of the darkest aspects was the use of experimental vaccines on people interned without their consent. In camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, thousands of prisoners were forced to participate in trials for vaccines against typhus, malaria, and tuberculosis. The victims were not chosen based on medical criteria, but rather on convenience. Logistics: they were locked in, couldn't refuse, and had no way to escape. In many cases, the doses weren't supervised by qualified physicians, and the procedures didn't follow any standard protocol. Some died from the direct effects of the substances, others from infections deliberately induced. Internal records used numerical codes to hide the subjects' names, and much of the data was never published. Behind these projects were institutes that claimed to work for the advancement of medicine. The Robert Koch Institute, for example, played a key role in studies on contagious diseases that were unethically administered to prisoners. In other cases, university clinics sent medical trainees to the camps to observe or participate in the trials. They learned how to administer injections, keep clinical records, or perform autopsies. Although these institutions officially claimed ignorance, documents show that they were aware of the type of patients being used. Private companies also participated. One of the most mentioned is IG Farben, the chemical consortium that produced medicines, dyes, and pesticides. Part of its pharmaceutical division collaborated on trials at Auschwitz, where a laboratory was set up inside the camp. From there, reports on the effectiveness of new substances were sent to Berlin. Antibiotics, anesthetics, and experimental compounds were tested on women, children, and men prisoners. Blood, organ, and tissue samples were preserved for later analysis. There was no follow-up or treatment for adverse reactions. Victims were replaced by others as soon as side effects became apparent. The connection between science and repression was not limited to the camps. In psychiatric hospitals or centers for people with disabilities, doctors recorded cases as if they were legitimate treatments. In reality, many patients were killed by overdose, asphyxiation, or neglect. Certificates were then issued with false diagnoses, such as sudden pneumonia or unexpected cardiac arrest. Families were notified by letter, with formal explanations and a note suggesting that the remains not be claimed. In these same centers, some bodies were sent to anatomy institutes to be used as study material. without any family consent. The justification for these acts was based on a concept that combined medicine with racial ideology. There was talk of national hygiene, purification of society, and health of the people. Health was no longer merely an individual matter, but a collective responsibility that had to be protected even at the cost of human life. Under this pretext, programs were designed to identify, isolate, and eliminate those who supposedly represented a risk to the country's vitality. People with syphilis, tuberculosis, epilepsy, or malformations were labeled as sources of genetic weakness. The same was true of alcoholics, repeat offenders, or individuals considered antisocial. Doctors not only carried out the orders, but often wrote them. At medical conferences organized by the regime, statistics on eliminated patients were presented, methods for administering lethal injections without leaving traces were discussed, and the costs of maintaining unproductive people were analyzed. Medicine became a tool for political and economic management. Some studies compared the monthly cost of maintaining a disabled person with that of feeding a healthy family. Based on these calculations, the idea was promoted that it was more efficient to eliminate the former. The files show how doctors filled out standardized forms with information about their patients indicating whether they were curable or incurable. The latter were sent to centers where active euthanasia was practiced. Many of these documents bore official seals and were signed by several doctors. Participation was collective, not individual. Diagnoses were reviewed by medical commissions that decided a person's fate in a matter of minutes. In some clinics, routines were established to administer lethal doses at night when there was less surveillance. Another aspect that appears in the reports is the systematization of cover-up. Internal codes were created to identify cases that were part of the euthanasia program without raising suspicion. Acronyms, file numbers, or vague terms such as urgent therapeutic intervention were used. Furthermore, clinical records were ordered to be destroyed once the patient had died. In some hospitals, admission books were rewritten by hand after deaths to conceal the fact that the person had ever been there. In the camps, something similar occurred with experiments. Subjects were not registered by name, but by number. Their reactions were recorded on loose sheets of paper that were filed in random order. If someone died, they were simply passed on to another. There was no intention to cure, only to observe. In internal SS reports, some officers complained that the results were not as useful as they had hoped, but they never criticized the methods. Rather, they suggested improving laboratory conditions to obtain more accurate data. There is also evidence of meetings between doctors from different regions to coordinate protocols. They shared experiences on how to apply certain treatments, how to write forms, or how to respond to potential inspections. These meetings didn't question the morality of the procedures, but rather their efficiency. Some asked for advice on which type of medication would most quickly induce death without causing convulsions, because this would make the assistant's work more difficult. Others discussed the benefits of using certain rooms with good ventilation to avoid odors. All of this was recorded in minutes circulated within the regime's medical structure. Scientific journals also played a key role. They published articles with technical language that masked the origin of the data. Some papers referred to clinical samples taken under controlled conditions, when in fact they were experiments conducted in concentration camps. The names of the subjects never appeared, and the methods were described in generic terms. Sometimes the results were presented as revolutionary discoveries. This allowed the authors to gain academic prestige without revealing the true source of the information. In several cases, these same doctors held important positions after the war, as their knowledge was valued by other countries that wanted to benefit from the data. While the Nazis carefully planned how to present an image of medical order and efficiency to the outside world, the true horrors were hidden behind technical terms and falsified records. The so-called T4 operation, for example, was presented as a medical assistance program, but in reality involved the systematic murder of thousands of people with disabilities. Medical reports were manipulated, autopsies were falsified, and records were destroyed or camouflaged with jargon few could understand. Most ordinary citizens didn't know what was happening, and those who did suspect it preferred to remain silent, because speaking out could cost them their lives. The regime's propaganda apparatus also played a central role in the cover-up. Films were broadcast showing clean hospitals, happy patients, and dedicated doctors, while the truth about forced sterilizations, covert euthanasia, and deadly experiments was hidden. Medical journals published articles referring to necessary therapeutic measures, without explaining that these measures consisted of killing with injections or starving to death. Even internal party documents used carefully constructed language to hide the crime behind cold, bureaucratic words. When the war ended and the atrocities committed were discovered, many doctors and officials tried to minimize their involvement. Some destroyed files, others falsified dates or changed names to hide evidence. During the Nuremberg trials, several defendants testified that they were only following orders, that they didn't know what was really going on, or that they had been misled by superiors. Many documents no longer existed or were incomplete, making it difficult to piece together the full picture. Despite this, testimony from survivors, prisoner doctors, and some recovered evidence helped reveal part of the truth. In the concentration camps, the situation was even more difficult to trace. The experiments were not always recorded in official reports, and if they were, they used codes or initials to conceal their traces. Diaries were destroyed, medical records were eliminated, and in many cases, bodies were cremated without leaving any traces. The same inmates who were forced to attend the procedures were later executed to prevent them from speaking out. This systematic elimination of witnesses was one of the regime's most effective strategies for erasing its crimes. Furthermore, some important figures in the medical field managed to avoid punishment. They changed their identities, fled to other countries, or were protected by governments interested in their knowledge. During the Cold War, certain allies preferred to turn a blind eye to the past of some scientists in order to benefit from their expertise. This fueled the myth that much of the truth was never known and that Nazi medical crimes were far more extensive than had been documented. The official silence, coupled with the fear of many witnesses and the systematic cover-up, made this part of history one of the most difficult to fully reconstruct. German universities also played a role in this silence. For years, they avoided investigating what happened or reviewing the history of their own professors. Some academics, those who had collaborated with the regime, continued to teach or publish without their past being examined. Medical associations also failed to press for clarification of what happened, and in many cases they opted to turn the page without delving into who was responsible. This generated a sense of impunity that lasted for decades. At the same time, German society faced a complex dilemma. On the one hand, there was a desire to rebuild the country and leave the horrors of the war behind. On the other, the recent past was still present in hospitals, universities, and government offices. Many Germans chose not to talk about the issue, and for a long time the victims of the Nazi medical system went unrecognized and uncompensated. Even the families of those killed in euthanasia programs struggled to obtain information or justice. It was only in the final decades of the 20th century that archives began to be opened, crimes publicly acknowledged, and tributes to the victims were held. Books were written, exhibitions organized, and the files of many doctors who had gone unpunished were reviewed. However, the damage had already been done. Much evidence had been lost, many witnesses had died, and many truths remained buried in burned reports or suppressed testimonies. Today, the study of Nazi medical crimes faces the challenge of separating documented information from rumors, real evidence from assumptions. Some exaggerated accounts of secret experiments have diverted attention from proven cases, while other crimes, equally atrocious, remain little known. The weight of cover-up continues to shape the way this part of history is told, and the difficulty in uncovering all the details demonstrates the extent to which lying was a central tool of the system. The strategy of concealment not only protected the perpetrators, but also erased the victims. Many of the names were never recovered, many bodies were never identified, and many families never knew what really happened. This lack of information was not an accident or a coincidence. It was an essential part of the mechanism, another cog in the wheel that allowed mass crimes to be carried out without leaving a trace. Thus, silence became a second form of violence, one that continues to affect those seeking justice or memory. Although the Nuremberg trials succeeded in establishing a significant portion of the facts, they also left gaps. Some of the main defendants died before being tried, others received light sentences, and several collaborated with the Allies in exchange for protection. The lack of complete evidence, the destruction of documents, and the defendants' defense strategies prevented a full conviction. Added to this was the post-war political context, where priorities shifted to the reconstruction of Europe and the containment of the Soviet bloc. In this environment, interest in pursuing medical criminals waned. The agencies charged with investigating former Nazis reduced their efforts, and the few prosecutions that followed international trials were limited. Only in the 1970s did new historical investigations and trials begin to emerge in Germany, driven by civil society organizations and journalists. Yet, many perpetrators died without facing justice, and many victims were never officially recognized. This combination of propaganda, bureaucratic manipulation, suppression of evidence, and historical omission made the cover-up of Nazi medical crimes one of the most effective and protracted of the 20th century. The way technical language was used to disguise murders, the way physical traces were erased, and the regime's ability to silence witnesses demonstrate a level of planning that goes beyond the crime itself. The goal was not only to kill, but to do so without leaving traces, without allowing questions, without opening space for memory, secrets, delusions, and the veil that cannot be broken. Some ideas related to Nazi medical practices transformed over time into rumors and theories that were difficult to verify. These versions deviated from the documented core, but they began to circulate as possible hidden truths, fueling the suspicion that certain experiments were never revealed. There was talk, for example, of testing with unconventional weapons, energy fields, or even forms of mental manipulation, but many of these ideas are unsupported by existing records and remain more in the realm of speculation than history. However, some of these theories arose because there were real gaps in the archives. Several documents disappeared, were destroyed, or were never recorded in the first place. This lack of evidence led some to believe that the most extreme crimes had not been fully discovered. Stories were also spread about underground bases in remote locations where extreme tests were allegedly carried out, far from witnesses, cameras, and any possible oversight. Some spoke of the Bavarian region, others of the Sudetenland, or even of underground facilities in Austria, but none of these hypotheses have been confirmed with firm evidence. One of the reasons these stories persisted was the ambiguous behavior of certain scientists and doctors after the war. Some of them were not tried, others simply changed their identities or continued working, both in Germany and abroad. This led to the belief that agreements were made to protect them in exchange for their knowledge. Testimonies from Allied soldiers who found empty facilities or incomplete archives also helped to keep this suspicion alive. In some cases, all that was found were charred remains of documents, unlabeled bottles, or devices whose use was not entirely clear. There were rumors about experiments involving telepathy, mind control, and extrasensory perception. There were mentions of experiments to induce altered states of consciousness and tests with unidentified chemicals, but many of these stories lacked solid foundation. Some were based on the testimony of former prisoners, although in some cases the statements were vague or contradictory. Journalists also sought out these stories because they were more compelling than the already known facts, which helped certain myths grow and blend with real elements. Another source of confusion was the German documents themselves, where sometimes they used code names or numbers to refer to experiments. This made subsequent interpretation of the files difficult. Some reports, for example, referred to Procedure Z or Group V without explaining exactly what they meant. These codes could be anything from actual medical studies to extermination operations, leaving room for ambiguity. In some cases, subsequent researchers were unable to clearly determine what was happening at each location because there were no surviving witnesses or the files were incomplete. After the war, both in West Germany and elsewhere, a kind of institutional silence was established on many issues. Despite the confessions obtained at Nuremberg, some aspects remained unclear. There was fear of stirring up the past too much or of discovering things that could compromise figures still active in the academic or political world. This silence wasn't always enforced. Sometimes it was simply a way of avoiding wounds or scandal. But this same lack of information contributed to the growth of rumors over the years. Over the following decades, books, films, and reports were published that revisited these theories. Some of these works sought to expose what hadn't been said, but others blended real data with fictional elements. Thus emerged stories of Nazi doctors escaping to South America to continue their experiments, or of research into immortality or genetic manipulation in secret laboratories. Although some of these accounts were based on documented facts, in many cases they were distorted or exaggerated to create shock value. This further complicated the separation between what actually happened and what existed only in the realm of the imaginary. In the academic field, researchers have attempted to review everything available to establish clear boundaries between fact and myth. Archives have been declassified, testimonies compared, and every experiment recorded at the concentration camps has been analyzed. Even so, there are grey areas. Some sites, such as Ravensbrück, Buchenwald and Natzweiler-Struthof, have incomplete or contradictory archives, and at certain facilities documents have disappeared entirely, making it difficult to reconstruct everything accurately. Furthermore, several witnesses did not survive or died without being able to recount what they saw, leaving gaps that are difficult to fill. The problem with these grey areas is that they fuel doubt. When a piece is missing, some prefer to think something was deliberately hidden. Others, however, believe it was the chaos at the end of the war that prevented all documentation from being preserved. Others also believe some experiments were so extreme that even the Nazis themselves refused to record them. But this idea, although possible, has no firm support in the known records. What is certain is that several doctors destroyed their notes, burned papers, or used false names to protect themselves. Another factor that reinforces suspicion is the participation of Nazi scientists in other countries' programs after the war. In the United States, for example, they were integrated into aviation, pharmacology, and even agency projects like NASA. This transfer of knowledge took place in the midst of the Cold War and was justified as a way to prevent the Soviets from recruiting these experts. However, this decision also generated criticism because moral judgment was set aside in exchange for scientific gain. Some of these doctors never faced charges and continued working as if nothing had happened. To this day, the topic continues to generate debate. Some researchers claim there are still archives to be discovered or testimonies that have not been revealed. Others maintain that the essentials are already known and that the rest belongs more to the realm of legend than history. The truth is that the cover-up existed both through direct action and omission. And this cover-up, beyond fueling extreme theories, has meant that many victims have never been recognized, nor have their stories been told clearly. The Nuremberg trials and the hunt for Nazis. After the liberation of the camps and the end of the war, the Allied powers decided to establish a tribunal to try the main leaders of the Nazi regime. It was a historically unprecedented process, an international trial in which 24 key figures of National Socialism would be brought to trial. The chosen venue was the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, a symbolic location because it had been the scene of the party's largest rallies and the racial laws that cemented the persecution of millions of people. The accused were political and military leaders and officials who had participated in the planning and execution of the genocide. Half of them received sentences ranging from forced labor to the death penalty. The others never felt the hangman's noose because they committed suicide before being executed or were convicted in absentia because they had already died at the time of the trial. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, took his own life rather than face the judges. In a cold and calculated act, he poisoned first his 6 children, then his wife, and finally himself. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, attempted to escape under a false identity using an eye patch. He was captured by the British but activated the cyanide capsule embedded in his tooth and died instantly. Adolf Hitler had done the same in Berlin on April 30, 1945, accompanied by Eva Braun. Other high-ranking officials, such as Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, disappeared in the chaos of the final days. The Soviets claimed to have shot him dead on a bridge near Berlin Central Station on May 2, 1945, but his body was only found decades later in 1972 and identified in 1998 through genetic testing. During his trial, he was sentenced to death in absentia. Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, was one of the most notorious defendants at Nuremberg. He had been a pilot in the First World War, a member of Hitler's inner circle and responsible for the Reich's economy in the early years of the conflict. After being captured by American troops, he was taken to court, where he remained for 18 days of hearings. He never showed remorse and maintained an arrogant demeanor, although privately he was depressed. He was sentenced to hang, but the night before his execution, he committed suicide with a cyanide capsule. There are differing versions on how he obtained the poison. Some claim he bribed a guard with a gold watch, while others claim he received the pill through a German woman pretending to send him medicine. The bodies of Göring and the others executed were cremated in Munich and their ashes thrown into the Isar River, a far more dignified fate than the one they had reserved for the millions of people murdered in the camps. On October 16, 1946, 10 condemned men were hanged in Nuremberg prison. Among them was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Reich Minister of Foreign Affairs. He had been one of the architects of the Pact of Steel with Mussolini's fascist Italy and the agreement with Japan that consolidated the Axis. He was found guilty of fomenting war and collaborating in the organization of genocide. He attempted to hide valuable objects before being captured, but was eventually stripped of all his possessions. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German Army's High Command, was another of those executed. He was considered submissive and extremely obedient to Hitler, to the point of being called the Führer's most stupid follower by his own comrades. He was found guilty of authorizing mass shootings during the invasions of Poland and France, as well as deportations and abuses against civilians. At his trial, he stated that he had never foreseen the consequences of his actions, but his words did not prevent his conviction. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office, was sentenced for leading the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SS intelligence service. During his years in command, he intensified executions in the concentration camps and was relentless in his persecution of opponents and Jews. His name was not as well known as that of other leaders, but his role was crucial in the extermination machinery. Alfred Rosenberg, a Nazi ideologue, was also executed. He had formulated racial theories and ethnic hierarchies that served as justification for genocide. He was convicted of inciting hatred and for his intellectual contributions to anti-Semitism. His manuscripts and personal documents were recovered after the war and are now on display in museums dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust. Hans Frank, lawyer and Governor-General of occupied Poland, was directly responsible for millions of deaths within his territory. During his trial, he expressed remorse and asked for divine mercy, but his role in the creation of ghettos and extermination camps led to his death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, had drafted many of the racial laws that provided the legal basis for the persecution. He was replaced in 1943, but continued to advise Hitler until the end. Julius Streicher, founder of the newspaper Der Stürmer, was executed despite having played no direct military role, as his violent propaganda contributed to the incitement of hatred and extermination. His execution was particularly dramatic, as the rope did not break his neck and he died slowly from asphyxiation. Fritz Sauckel, head of forced labor, organized the exploitation of 6 million prisoners. Women, men, and children were forced to work up to 18 hours a day without food or medical care. Alfred Jodl, a member of the military high command, was convicted for his participation in the campaigns in Norway and Denmark. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, governor of occupied Holland, was sentenced for collaborating in mass shootings and deportations. In the early hours of October 16th, they were all hanged in Nuremberg prison. Their bodies were briefly displayed before being cremated, and their remains scattered alongside Göring's in the Isar River. The trials set a precedent in international law by establishing the category of crimes against humanity. However, not all those responsible were brought to justice. Some died before being captured, others managed to escape, and many went into hiding under new identities. Subsequent trials were more limited and focused on lower-ranking officials. Although Nuremberg represented a turning point, the truth is that thousands of Nazi leaders were never brought before a tribunal. Some managed to escape during the chaos of the final months of the war, others relied on support networks that helped them flee to South America, and many simply melted into the German population, taking advantage of the widespread devastation. Among the most notorious cases was that of Adolf Eichmann, architect of the logistics that allowed the deportation of millions of Jews to the extermination camps. Eichmann was captured by US troops in 1945, but managed to escape from a prison camp thanks to the confusion of those times. With the help of Nazi sympathizers, he moved to Italy and from there managed to reach Argentina with a false passport provided by the Red Cross. For years, he lived on the outskirts of Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement, until in 1960, an Israeli Secret Service unit tracked him down and kidnapped him, taking him to Jerusalem. There he was tried, sentenced to death, and executed in 1962. Another case was that of Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death of Auschwitz. Responsible for atrocious medical experiments on prisoners, especially twins, Mengele also escaped in 1945. He first went into hiding in Germany and then, with the help of support networks, traveled to Argentina in 1949. For almost a decade, he resided in Buenos Aires under his real name, protected by the local German community. After Eichmann's capture, Mengele fled to Paraguay and later to Brazil, where he drowned in 1979 while swimming at a beach. His body was exhumed and identified through DNA testing in 1985. Martin Bormann, whose death during the fall of Berlin had been assumed but never confirmed, became one of the most wanted fugitives for decades. Rumors about his presence in South America fueled the idea that he had managed to escape, although remains found in 1972 showed that he had died in May 1945, probably attempting to flee west. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former lieutenant, was the protagonist of a unique episode. In 1941, he had flown alone to Scotland to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom, but was imprisoned. After the war, he was tried in Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent more than 40 years in Spandau prison in Berlin until he was found dead in his cell in 1987. The authorities declared that he had committed suicide, although rumors circulated for years, theories that he may have been murdered. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon for his role in the persecution of the French resistance, managed to escape to Bolivia in 1951 thanks to false documents supplied by clandestine networks. For years, he lived under the name Klaus Altmann, even collaborating with local military governments. He was not extradited to France until 1983, where he was tried for crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. Many of the Nazis who escaped did so through what later became known as the rat routes. These escape routes were organized primarily from Austria and Italy, with the help of Nazi sympathizers, members of the church, and networks of former officers. From ports like Genoa and Naples, they managed to embark for South American countries, especially Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, and Brazil, where they found refuge and communities willing to welcome them. The Allies attempted to stop these escapes, but the magnitude of the task and the lack of coordination made it impossible. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, various groups of Nazi hunters dedicated themselves to tracking down fugitives. The most famous was Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to gathering information on criminals in hiding. Thanks to his work, many were located and brought to justice. In Germany, the post-Nuremberg trials continued, albeit with less impact. Trials were held against doctors, judges, SS officers, and businessmen who had collaborated with the regime. However, many of the defendants received light sentences or were released shortly afterward, partly due to the need to rebuild the country and secure a skilled workforce in the post-war period. The 1946 executions did not mark the end of the trial. Years later, additional trials were held, known as the Nuremberg secondary trials. Doctors who participated in experiments on prisoners, businessmen who profited from slave labor, and officials from various ministries were prosecuted. These trials documented the use of prisoners as guinea pigs in medical research, which will be directly linked to the experiments discussed in the next chapter. The testimony collected during these trials detailed how thousands of people were subjected to tests without consent, injections with diseases, exposure to low temperatures, mutilations, and surgeries without anesthesia. These accounts served as irrefutable proof of the systematic nature of the abuse. The collected documentation became a fundamental basis for understanding the magnitude of the experiments the Nazis had attempted to conceal. The creation of the Nuremberg Tribunal also set legal precedents. It introduced the concept of crimes against humanity and made it clear that following orders was not a valid excuse for atrocities. This doctrine would form the basis of international justice in subsequent decades. The contrast between the severity with which some leaders were treated and the leniency toward many junior collaborators generated debates that continue to this day. Some of those responsible were hanged or sentenced to life imprisonment, while others managed to reintegrate into post-war German society without major consequences. The hunt for Nazis spanned decades, with operations on different continents. In Israel, the capture and execution of Eichmann became a symbol of delayed justice. In Europe, trials like Barbie's in France showed that even if time passed, crimes did not expire. In Latin America, the presence of fugitives fueled diplomatic tensions and revealed the existence of networks that had operated for years. The echo of Nuremberg and the persecution of those responsible for Nazism was not limited to punishing the guilty. It also sought to establish a historical record, a memory that would prevent denying what happened. The thousands of pages of testimonies, documents, and photographic evidence collected during those trials constitute one of the most comprehensive sources on the genocide to this day. The conclusion of the trials made it clear that, although many of the top leaders had died or escaped, what was discovered in the camps and in the courts revealed an organized system of extermination. This network included laws, orders, doctors, scientists, and bureaucrats. The next chapter will delve into precisely that dimension: the medical experiments performed on prisoners, the tests carried out in the name of science, and the desperate attempts to cover them up when defeat was imminent.